We are back at Georgetown Views from the Bench, the ABI program this year in Washington, talking with Laura Davis Jones from Pachulski, Stang, Ziehl and Jones in Wilmington. Laura just came off an interesting panel about creditors committees and their uses. So we want to talk a little bit about some of the issues that we're engaged in. Of course, Chapter 11 practice, everybody knows, is changing dramatically, including the use of committees. Cases are getting faster, going faster. They're taking a shorter amount of time. Some don't even have committees, at all. But clearly, there are parties who need to be represented through the bankruptcy process. So let's talk about those sort of representation issues. Let's talk about cases, for example, tough cases where you have maybe a handful of secured creditors, major note holders, but then on the other hand, you've got hundreds, maybe thousands of claimants, tort claimants, abuse claimants. I know your firm's involved in a lot of these cases.
Yes.
How do you reconcile those interests fairly in the bankruptcy process?
Well, I think what you're seeing evolve is that the U.S. trustee program is recognizing that there needs to be representation of these various folks. And so there's more of a tolerance for multiple committees. I think we can start there. So in the sex abuse cases,
Right.
you often will see a survivors committee.
Right.
Or in the mass tort cases like Takata, where we had the separate tort committee. Our committee itself was mixed with respect to the types of claims that were in that tort system. Or that had tort claims, but it had to be separate from the commercial committee because it's so different. And there's also such a push and pull
Right.
between those various claimants that if you don't have official committees for these various claimants, they're not going to have a place at the table.
Right, right. Like Weinstein would be another example.
Exactly.
Which I know the firm's involved in. I mean, it just seems to the outside observer, the issues are so complicated. There is a fixed sum. There's not unlimited amount of money out there to satisfy every claim in full, obviously. Somebody's going to be out of the money. How do the committees appointed to represent different parties, how do they come back to reconcile to get something approved by a court?
I think what happens is if you have strong advisors for the committees and very strong financial advisors so that people can stress test what is really there, what's in the estate, not just taking somebody's word for it, but actually seeing, and sometimes people think out of the box where value might be. Then they stress test it together and they come up with something, hopefully consensually. And that leaves the individual claimants in good hands because they've got good advisors that are looking at it. There used to be, back in the 90s, when you had an extra committee, sometimes the courts would try to limit their breadth or limit the amount that they could be paid, put budgets on them and so forth. That's pretty much changed because everybody realizes that the more sophistication you have at the table and the more representation you have at the table, frankly, the faster the case is going to go and the more efficient it's going to be.
These cases are complicated. They cost a lot.
They do.
Right? So there's also a shock value when it's reported in the press about how much has been gone to professionals, allocated to professionals. Can you speak to that issue about?
Well, there's been a lot of data over the years on how expensive the bankruptcy process is or is not. And I think in the end, what the data has all shown is whether you do it out of court or you do it in court, there's really not a big difference. That time has to be spent, that stress testing, as I call it, has to be done. And frankly, the bankruptcy process, at least in my perspective, gives so much more transparency to it and so much more structure to it that I think it's actually, in the end, more efficient.
All right. Very insightful. Thank you, Laura, for
Thank you.
all your help on the program. And that's it for Views from the Bench.